My concern is 30 or more years evidence of increasing welfare need. Evidence mainly from Bureau of Statistics show that welfare has been increasing at a rate of 1%, nearly 1%, every 5 years for well over 30 years. And other research has shown that the welfare population has increased at exactly the same rate, 1%, nearly 1% a year over 5 years. This is not common to, is not just in Australia, it's happening in every Western culture, and surely must be one of the very important reasons for and economic problems.
Thank you, sir.
Now,
do you have a question for the panel?
Yes, I have. Got to have the problem. It is absolutely, no, I'm medically trained, and it's absolutely panel is what is their opinion of paying welfare beneficiaries a very generous extra payment not to become pregnant while on welfare, and also should parenting licenses be considered?
I don't like the idea of paying people to do the right thing. I think, I do think, I mean, I talked in my presentation about learning to some extent from the Americans on these issues. I think there are two simple rules that the Americans have, for example, that I would introduce here. One of them is that if a woman has another child while on welfare, that ever since 1996 in the States, the benefit has been capped. So you shouldn't be able to be in a position where you know that you're relying on other people supporting you, and then you put yourself in even greater need. That's something that I think should be resisted, and the Americans have resisted it since 1996. What the Americans also have on their child support rule is that the children that a man produced first have prior claim on that man's income over subsequent children, and everybody knows that rule, and therefore if a woman takes up with a guy who already has responsibilities for children elsewhere, she knows that if she has children with him, that her children will get second call, they'll be second in the queue behind the existing children that he's already left behind. And I think that that's an excellent rule as well. And what both of those rules do is that they modify behaviour. I mean, in the short term, one can say, hang on, what about the child? I mean, if you cap the benefit of a woman on welfare, doesn't that mean that the next children she has, you know, will suffer? And to some extent it does, but it means that people are a lot less likely to then go on having children that they can't afford to raise, and that they're probably not raising properly, to pick up Jeremy's point. And ditto with the child support rule. It means that, and there is evidence from the States, that knowing that if you take up with a guy who's already got child support responsibilities, that you're not going to get, you're going to be behind in the queue to get your own children's support. It means that people are much more guarded about having children in that situation. So I'd explore those kind of rules before talking about paying people not to have babies, which I feel is opening up a whole can of worms there about paying people to do what they ought to be doing anyway.
Thank you, Peter. So.
My question's for Peter again. You ended your first speech by saying the society you advocate is a coerced society, but a just society. Is this correct?
What I said was that the American system, it seems to me, is a coercive system. And the American system, I mean, if I can just clarify, the American system of requiring men to pay, even if they don't have the capacity to do so, is potentially leads you down a coercive strategy, because if the guy then doesn't get work for whatever reason, you start sequestering money from his bank accounts, he loses his driving license, that you start going into negative sanctions against him. And eventually, if the arrears build up to such a large extent, then he ends up in jail, and there's about 10,000 men in American jails serving jail sentences for failure to pay child support. Again, though, I would make the same point in relation to that I just made over here, that maybe that's the price you pay for ensuring that not many men get into that situation in the first place. But I prefer the German system, which is not a coercive system. I think the German system uses normative, existing relationships within families rather than coercion from outside.
Well, I would argue that...
sorry.
No, I mean,
wasn't
to be
my
fair,
question.
Peter, he didn't
Okay.
get around to asking his question.
Okay.
How can one individual, purely due to family relation, be obliged to be responsible for his family member?
Because somebody has to be responsible. That guy has had children, and it costs money to raise those children. So the question is, well, who has the prior responsibility? I think it's true that we all share a responsibility ultimately to ensure that those children are supported properly. The question is whether the responsibility that I have for your children as a complete stranger is the same as the responsibility that, say, your mum has for those children as their grandmother. And it seems to me that the responsibility lies first within the family, clearly first with the parents. If the parents can't or won't fulfill that responsibility, then within the more extended family, before you start coming to me and I don't even know you. It's a moral principle here that somebody has got to pay. So better the people who are close to the child than people who have absolutely no connection with it other than just being taxpayers who happen to live in the same jurisdiction.
Thank you, Peter. Yes.
May I ask a general question about the empowerment of the community to help? The theme of this from my handout is welfare without the state. And we've heard a lot about the fact that there's an enormous amount that's actually required. But it seems to me that the community generally is being disempowered. Hillary Clinton said memorably, it takes a village to bring up a child. Well, these days, my wife and I have finished raising our family. Our grandchildren live abroad. I don't know how many certificates we'd have to go through to help the locals look after their children. Children come home from school. Their parents both work. We're not going to go through the certification process to become qualified as child workers. We've brought up children. Is there a pattern that could be gone through which would enable the community to do more help itself? We have a volunteer schedule in Australia. Do you know there's a waiting list? You have to go onto a schedule to be able to volunteer. Why is it that we are so awful at actually seeming to be able to use the considerable goodwill that's in the community to actually help ourselves?
Thank you. Tapping the sector. Jeremy.
There's a strong, within child protection services and family support services, there's a strong bias. There's a strong bias towards professionalising of all those services, ensuring that the service providers and carers have got appropriate degrees, and there's strong resistance to any form of more informal, old-fashioned, for want of a better term, submit and Paul casework approach, where ordinary citizens would go around and provide people with the sort of assistance and advice that they need. I think that's just the part of the political economy of the welfare industry, and I agree. There was actually an example in Victoria where there was a record. One of the numerous reports that have been put out about child protection suggested that retired people, such as yourself perhaps, could go around and visit these families to make sure that the kids were being looked after. But that was quickly squashed both by the social services sector.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, sir. The gentleman in the front.
I have a question. What happens to the notion of dignity of work when one uses work as kind of punishment in the social welfare system?
I don't think
John?
it's punishment. I think it's the state declaring that it's better for people to be in work rather than to be idle. Again, it's the state remoralising itself, I think, first. And then I was going to say remoralise the community, but I don't think it needs to do that. As I said in my piece, I think the community accepts that value. And I don't think anyone would think that to ask a man to work rather than just receive a dole in idleness is punishment.
Just looking at the Sioux Indian example, it seems that many of the other talks has been talking about that people have been, the increase in warfare is because people are becoming increasingly irresponsible and unwilling to work. But what I'm trying to say is that from the Sioux industry, Indians example there, is that it's not the fault of the people, it is the fault of the government. The government has mismanaged the economy, causing the problem, and also we can see that in the 1920s it printed too much money, then caused the Great Depression, and then people feel it does have a responsibility to help those who are truly needy because it's caused by government, not people. So do you think the government should articulate a clear, logical goals which provides an economic program that provides strong economic growth without inflation, which doesn't have business cycles, and it promotes growth in all segments of the economy with no special favors to any segments, including business, to prevent this up and down cycle going into more and more welfare every time it goes into a recession, more welfare, and then comes out a bit, and then more welfare again.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gary, is that a question for you?
Why not? I don't think governments cannot abolish the business cycle. But what we find is that when governments leave labour markets well enough alone, that the unemployment caused by a downturn in the economy jumps back, or employment jumps back much more readily. So that the message has been that governments do well by acting as a backup and getting out of the way really quickly when 22 million Australians decide that they want to invest and work. And it's that sort of interplay where government steps in and stays in the game that you find that these large levels of unemployment remain as we have had in the 70s, 80s and 90s. But more recently, we didn't have that long-running levels of unemployment where men just never returned to the workforce because we had freer rules.
Annie, do you have anything to add to that?
I see a role in our particular case for government, not the federal government so much as the First Nations governments and responsibilities therein. What I was talking about earlier on is that people forget that it's taken many, many years for all of the institutions to be and have been developed, whether it be kindergarten through to grade 12, through university. It takes, as this one gentleman was saying, a whole village and indeed a whole country to be able to create the kind of institutional backup that's necessary to create an economy. And you need all of those aspects to be able to work together. And in my situation, we need our government to be able to be a government, but at the same time, we need to be able to have individuals who have an ability to be able to imagine something that isn't there yet. Because most of our people are dependent on somebody else, and that has to change. And that can only be changed by all of us taking responsibility for our own destiny.
Thank you, Manny. A final question.
Yes, I was very interested in what Peter was saying about the German system where the family, the parents are responsible for the delinquent children, fathers, because Mark Stein was saying something about that too, and he did not explain how Germany ever managed to get away with it, because Germany is normally pretty compliant. I mean, didn't everybody scream and tell them they were being fascist and awful and patriarchal and all the rest of it? What is their secret?
Well, it's simply, it's something I'm still trying to find out more about, to be honest, about how this works on the ground and what German public opinion thinks about it and whether it's always applied or whether it's there on the statute book and people try to ignore it. But and I just can't find any evidence on this. So if anybody in the room comes across anything, please do email me with it. I mean, it's the point is it's written into the German Civil Code, so it was part of the basic law set up after the Second World War. This was one of the I'm sorry. No. This is part of the core law of the country. This principle, and then it gets applied in a number of ways. And one of the ways it's applied is in the context of welfare. It's applied in other ways too. So I'm very taken with it because, I mean, for a long time, and in a sense, one of the underlying themes of this evening's discussion, I think, is the issue of crowding out. You know, in a sense, the more the family does, it was an answer to one of the earlier questions as well. I mean, don't go and play golf, okay? I mean, do. But I mean, it's the more the state takes upon itself, the less there is for what Edmund Burke famously called the little platoons of family and community and church to do. And I was very struck many years ago when in academia, I gave my professorial inaugural lecture on precisely this. At that time in Britain, the Parliament was legislating on childcare, institutional childcare for the under-5s. And it was quite clear that what was going to happen was three things. One, it was going to make childcare extremely expensive. Secondly, it was probably going to at least regulate the quality in such a way that it would be more predictable than it currently was. But at the price of, thirdly, knocking out a whole load of informal institutions that were currently managing childcare. It wasn't the case that there was no childcare and then the government came along and put it in. It was the case that there was a patchwork system of childcare which neighbours were doing, which family was doing, you know, which commercial organisations were doing, which got knocked out as soon as the government said, well, we think we can do this better. And I think the whole, you know, I mean, John would probably agree that a large part of the history of the welfare state in these Western countries over, certainly since the Second World War, probably since the First World War, has been precisely this story of the government coming along and then the unintended consequences of very well-intended interventions being that you knock out a whole lot of civil society, small-scale activity that was previously going on to provide for those things.
Well, the reason for that is you have to get all those graduates employed that you keep wanting to send to university. I mean, otherwise they're going to be rioting in the streets and occupying things.
Yes.
And so this is why you have a big bureaucracy. Nobody seems to have ever figured that out yet. I have yet to hear anyone sort of really address this problem. And it's very odd.